Everyone. We're just going to wait just a few moments to let everybody get settled. I think there are a couple of people still coming in on Zoom. I'll come back to you in a moment. Well, welcome to you all, and thank you very much for attending today. I think that this is going to be a very highly informative event, which should lead us to a really important conversation about how we as a society respond to the issue of domestic violence and abuse in our country. We have a most impressive panel of speakers today, including Sarah Benson, who is the CEO of Women's Aid, Niamh Ní Dhomhnaill, an extraordinary woman who's going to speak to us about her own lived experience of domestic and sexual abuse. We have with us Garda Commissioner Drew Har and His Honour Judge Colin Daly, who's President of the District Court, and also Roderic TD is a very recently appointed Minister for Children, Disability, Equality and Integration. And I know that each of these speakers has absolutely invaluable perspectives to bring to us on how they can act in their different roles to tackle domestic violence. I'm Ailbhe Smyth and I'm Chairperson of Women's Aid. I'm absolutely delighted to be at the helm of today's discussion because I know how vital it is to create these kinds of spaces where we can have the conversations, where we can glean the information, where we can enrich our understanding of the ways in which we need and must and can tackle domestic violence. There's just a couple of very small housekeeping pieces to begin with. The webinar is being recorded and we'll email you a link to it very, very shortly. We have a very packed agenda to get through, as I think you're probably all aware, but we do want to stick to our time scale. But there is a little time allowed at the end for questions and answers, and you'll see a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. A member of staff is going to be keeping an eye on your comments and questions, and we will be, we hope, able to put a number of these questions to the panel before the session concludes. So I'm going to move straight away to introduce our first speaker. And it's with very, very great pleasure that I introduce Sarah Benson, the very recently appointed CEO to Women's Aid. Sarah took on that role just in May 2019, and she has made it her own in a very, very short space of time. And today, she'll be outlining the tremendous work done by the team at Women's Aid and give an insight into the levels of domestic abuse against women and children disclosed to Women's Aid in 2019 and more recently in the shadow of the COVID-19 pandemic. So to speak to us at the launch of the annual impact report 2019 and the supplementary report on domestic violence during the COVID-19 emergency. I'm very happy to ask Sarah Benson to address us. Sarah.
Thank you, Ailbhe, and a very warm welcome to my fellow speakers, who we are really honoured to have join us today for the launch of the Women's Aid Annual Report for 2019 and our supplementary report, which tells about our experiences during this COVID-19 crisis so far. Hello, and thanks also to everyone who's logged on with us this morning. I know we have some hundreds of people attending, and we're also live streaming on Facebook. Just to acknowledge there's a wonderful variety of colleagues from both the domestic and sexual violence services and children's rights organisations. We have public representatives and officials, health and legal professionals, members of Garda Síochána, the policing authority, the Garda Inspectorate, the court services, and also never forgetting individual activists, students, and of course those individuals who have their own lived experience of domestic abuse. It's great to have you all join us for what we aim to be an informative, though possibly sobering and jarring, but I hope ultimately optimistic session today. Some of you may have had a chance to view the two reports that we're launching today, or you can download them after the session. They're now live on our website, womensaid.ie, and you can find links to them through our Facebook and Twitter accounts. So you can read about all the areas of our work, including our training services, our public campaigns and advocacy, as well as the frontline work, which will be my primary focus this morning. I want to just first acknowledge the whole team for their incredible contributions, both in 2019 and also during these recent challenging times, to deliver the multifaceted work of Women's Aid, and also our wonderful board, our voluntary board, who have been so supportive throughout these really difficult times. I'm going to open up first with a short video, just about 3 minutes, which will give you just a snapshot of our impact and our activities during 2019 and the COVID-19 crisis of this year.
One-to-one supports, our court accompaniment service, listening, believing, supporting. This is what we do in Women's Aid. For over 40 years, women facing domestic violence have turned to us for support. We support women through the National Free Phone Helpline, through our one-to-one supports, our court accompaniment service, and our Dolphin House court support and referral service. In 2019, we received 20,763 contacts, during which 24,049 disclosures of domestic abuse against women and children were made. Now, in 2020, working in the shadow of COVID-19, our services have been stretched to the limit. COVID-19 has shone a further light on the levels of domestic violence in homes across Ireland. As we all retreated to our homes for safety, it became increasingly clear that home is not a safe place for everyone. I feel I've no choice but to put up with his unacceptable behaviour all day, every day, because I'm literally locked inside the house with him. Between March and the end of June, there has been a 43% increase in calls to our 24-hour helpline and a 71% increase in visits to the Women's Aid website. There has also been a 25% increase in calls to the Gardaí for help. I've thought about ending my life just to escape the situation. Women's Aid has had to respond fast. Due to government restrictions, we had to move our dedicated face-to-face drop-in support and referral service in Dolphin House to a phone service. But in doing so, we extended our opening hours to increase accessibility for women trying to seek court protection. We also increased our general online instant messaging support service by 32 hours a week to assist helpline users who could only reach out in silence. We sourced free radio and print advertising to promote the availability of the 24-hour National Free Phone Helpline, letting anyone who was experiencing abuse know that we are still here. Raising awareness during COVID-19 has been important, not just to showcase the epidemic of domestic violence that is happening now, but the violence and abuse that has always taken place behind closed doors in Ireland. In 2019, we welcomed the newly commenced provisions of the Domestic Violence Act. This protects women in dating relationships as well as establishing the crime of coercive control. It is vital for women in Ireland that the government continues to prioritise a national response to domestic violence and abuse. Now, more than ever, we need government to follow through on its commitments, to audit and improve existing domestic violence infrastructure, including coordination, to prioritise family law court reform, to commit to a victim-centred reform of the criminal justice system's response to domestic and sexual violence, and to tackle the growing problem of online abuse. I feel completely trapped, suffocated, and I'm frightened of telling anyone in case matters escalate and the situation gets even worse. Women's Aid. Listening, believing, supporting.
So, what are we concluding from our two reports? Well, there's several things. Firstly, demand for services is increasing. We know that even prior to the COVID-19 crisis, we were seeing an increase in demands for our services. And we know that this isn't just us, but also other specialist domestic and indeed sexual violence services. We already know that the vast majority of those who suffer domestic and sexual abuse, and indeed significant sexual abuse, occurs in the context of intimate partner abuse, never contact services for a variety of reasons, which I'll say a little bit more about shortly. But nonetheless, there is an increase in demand for our services between 2018 and 2019. Factors here might include the commencement of the Domestic Violence Act in January of 2019, which increased that availability of court protection to individuals in dating relationships, and also introduced the crime of coercive control with the commencement of the Act. And through the efforts of advocates and domestic violence organisations, including ourselves, arguably there did come an increased level of public discourse on this issue. If this led to an increase in contacts with our services, this is really welcome. In a way, it's good news because we know that even with 20,763 contacts with Women's Aid services in 1 year, and the thousands of others our colleagues in other services are supporting, we are still all only meeting a small proportion of the women suffering abuse. When based on the Fundamental Rights Agency report, we know that as many as 1 in 3 women in Ireland will suffer some form of abuse from a current or former partner. We know how many we are not meeting, not supporting to access safety and justice. So why is this? And that question leads me to our second conclusion, which is that we need to do far more to encourage and facilitate those who are abused to speak out without fear and without stigma, which means being very explicit in focusing our responsibility for abuse and violence where it ought to be, with the perpetrator and not the victim. We give some of the key findings in our annual report from an online independent survey, which we commissioned in late 2019 and was conducted by Dr. Cathy Walsh and Dr. Gráinne Healy. In it, we heard from 937 respondents, the overwhelming majority of whom were women. We wanted to know where victims and survivors were seeking support, what they found most useful and what they found unhelpful. And we also wanted to ask those who had not accessed any support, why not? One of the most saddening findings of the survey was for me the fact that firstly, 1/3 of those who responded had never reached out for support. And then second, the fact that respondents reported that their #1 barrier to speaking out, where fear of the abuser was second, their #1 barrier was fear of other people finding out what was going on. Also highly reported were fear of not being believed, concerns over stigma, and feeling ashamed. And these feelings don't come from nowhere. These are absorbed socially and culturally, where victims and survivors are inhibited from speaking the truth of their experience for fear of being stigmatized, blamed, or just dismissed. We must build on public and indeed private conversations that have been had so far to encourage dialogue, awareness, and understanding of the dynamics of domestic abuse, which is rooted in inequality and motivated by a desire for power and control. We must examine the tactics of abusers and also the far-reaching and complex impacts of this abuse. Knowing and naming these will influence how we then perceive and more effectively respond to victims and perpetrators alike. We're clearly not there yet. We have much work to do, but I feel like good groundwork has been set. So, That was 2019, and then came COVID-19. And what we were already observing in terms of an increase in demands for our services took a whole new upturn. The Women's Aid National Free Phone Helpline responded to 43% more calls during this period compared to the same time in 2019. Of course, we did work to increase awareness of the service by raising awareness of our concerns for those whose homes were unsafe and seeking and receiving free media, radio and print space from local and national outlets, for which we remain really grateful. We were terrified that the lockdown would have an immediate chilling effect and that calls would just drop. We ran ads highlighting the national 24-hour helpline number and also signposted in our print ads the local domestic violence services through Safe Ireland's website, as well as the Garda emergency number. This was then followed by the Still Here government-funded campaign developed with the Department of Justice in partnership with ourselves and other key stakeholders such as Safe Ireland, the Dublin Rape Crisis Centre, the Rape Crisis Network of Ireland, and the Men's Development Network, who run the free phone helpline for male victims, and the National Women's Council. But even with our awareness raising efforts, we were blown away by the volume of calls. Women and their allies needing to talk, to be heard, to get informed, and to strategize around trying to stay as safe as they could in extremely aggravating circumstances. Irrespective of the surge in calls, we also know that for many women, the options to further act, to reach out, and to seek practical protection have been horribly constrained. Accessing courts, for example, became an impossible challenge for some women, and the number of applications for protective orders did drop during this period. Women described to us the way that they were trying to ride it out under restrictions until they eased, and then they could once again try and find legitimate pretexts to leave the house under cover of perhaps going to work or visiting family, or access childcare while they sought judicial assistance, or simply be permitted to get to a loved one's home for a bit of shelter and respite. These things are slowly happening now as we open up a bit more, but we are not through this yet. So what I want to draw as my final conclusion, the optimistic one, is that we do have opportunities here in the midst of this challenge. Where the cracks of Ireland's response to domestic abuse were starkly revealed, there was also hope and positivity. Our own staff and volunteer team adapted quickly and flexibly, including an important expansion of our online instant messaging service. And they came together to rally to Women's Aid. And I'm so incredibly thankful to them for that. And this has also been a period of partnership and innovation, particularly with and by our colleagues in Safe Ireland, our fellow specialist support, domestic and sexual violence services, and others who've come together to amplify the voices of victims and survivors, to propose solutions to ease their situation, and to engage with statutory services, agencies, businesses, and government to progress more effective responses. I've noted the government campaign delivered in partnership with specialist services. We've also seen proactive Garda operations to prioritise domestic abuse responses, and there have been initiatives in social protection and with private businesses to make access to resources, accommodation and assistance more accessible. There has been an outpouring of community concern, generosity and creativity to assist services and to raise public awareness of these heinous and preventable crimes. A concerted whole of government, whole of community response is now required in order to prevent domestic violence, to protect women and children, and to hold perpetrators to account. These are the three legs of one stool. This needs to be a social and a state priority. Let's not squander this opportunity. It feels like it may have taken a crisis, but it has shown us that where there's a will, there is a way for us all to make better and to do it faster. So thank you for your kind attention to my opening observations. And I now have the honour of introducing our next contributor, who is Niamh Ní Dhomhnaill. Niamh is a psychologist in training, and she also has her own lived experience of domestic, including sexual abuse, which she has courageously spoken publicly about, having waived her right to anonymity on the sentencing of her former partner for rape and sexual assault. Niamh unfortunately had work obligations today, but she generously met with us for a conversation earlier this week about her thoughts about domestic and sexual abuse and her responses to the 2 Women's Aid reports published today. So we have these thoughts here for you now by video. Thank you.
My own lived experience of domestic abuse and sexual violence, I think, changed everything about me irrevocably. When I think back to that time, I think I was just scared and anxious all of the time. I didn't know what I would be coming home to. I never knew what I was going to do wrong. I never knew what response that would prompt. It was really difficult for me to know how to keep myself safe. And being kind of consistently confronted with someone who said that they would take their own life if I left them, I found myself trying to navigate some kind of pathway of safety and really not knowing how. And I suppose it got to a point then where it was just easier to not kind of get too involved in arguments, to just kind of take a quieter approach than maybe I had previously. I think it's funny, the first barrier that I think to name in terms of coming to terms with what had been happening to me was myself, was recognising it for what it is. I think in naming myself as a barrier, I think actually I have to think a little bit more, a bit more broadly. And actually, if I wasn't recognising what was happening to me as domestic abuse, then it was actually because there wasn't enough information or supports around me for me to know that it was that. I think it was at a time where really my how I conceptualized domestic abuse was purely through the physical. So if I was being berated, I didn't see that as abuse. If I was being frightened or intimidated, I didn't see that as abuse. If I was, nearly hit but not hit, it didn't count because it wasn't physical contact. And I suppose at some point something happens where you just can't anymore. It's no longer safe, or you've reached a breaking point. And for me, that was understanding that Magnus's actions were not just within the kind of emotional abuse category or the fear or the threat, but that they had been quite consistently for a long time within the kind of sexual violence framework. And it was incredibly scary to say that for the first time. I didn't use the words rape. I just couldn't. I didn't want to see myself as a victim. I couldn't bear to think about the reality of all of this. So I used very, language that was couched, that was hidden. So I remember telling a friend at the time that he had been having sex with me while I was asleep. And she immediately said, that's not sex, that's rape. And I knew it when she said it, but it was so hard to hear. Because language is really important, and I just wasn't ready to view it in those terms. I think what surprises me still about all of this is that there's still a lot of shame perhaps there on my part. And I think I didn't like being called brave when I first waived my anonymity a few years ago, because I didn't think that I was being brave. I thought I was just doing what the right thing to do was. But I suppose now I'm in a kind of a strange place where this is known about me. It's widely known. If someone Googles me, it's there. And I'm also trying to navigate a profession where we don't really tend to talk about our experiences. And before I began my training, I was warned that if I had spoken about this publicly, I wouldn't get into training, and it would pose all sorts of difficulties for me professionally. And so now I find myself almost reconfronting that stigma and shame again, because although I believe in this very strongly, I'm also facing that kind of worry and concern about what will colleagues, what will managers think about me now that they know this about me. Will I be seen as less of a psychologist, less capable of doing my work because of what's happened to me? And obviously that shame or stigma isn't that strong, or I'm not buying into it enough that, you know, it doesn't prevent me from speaking. But I think it's really important to name, and I think if I'm experiencing that, I can only imagine what it's like for others who are too frightened to talk about it, who maybe are still at the cusp of realising what their experiences are. And I actually think for those reasons it's really important that I continue to speak, not just publicly, but with colleagues of mine, and for us to talk about shame and stigma within our own circles. I really don't want to be known as a victim or a survivor, because it consistently ties me to an individual whose actions I didn't control. They weren't my actions, they were his, and I don't see why I should be defined by his. What feels really important for me now, at the kind of position that I'm in now as a psychologist in clinical training, is that I'm modelling hope and recovery for those that I work with, or perhaps those who will see this, or who have read or seen things that I've contributed to, and they can see that there is life beyond something really awful happening to you. So I suppose in looking at the annual report, just in the kind of general sense, I think perhaps the thing that struck me most was, well, there were two things: that the majority of the disclosures are being made to the helpline. And I think that's really important because it speaks to something around the safety of not being face-to-face with someone when talking about these things. And the second thing that really struck me was the huge amount, the majority of what women were talking about was emotional abuse. I think shame and stigma were highlighted all throughout the report as both barriers and reasons why maybe perhaps people don't want to go too far with kind of discussing their experiences. And I think in terms of a wider society approach, we need to start actually confronting our own biases. I think we need to be open that some of us, most of us on some level, will have a sense of stigma or shame or prejudice about people who've experienced sexual violence and domestic abuse. And it's no use saying that we don't have them. So I suppose when I read this year's report, what touched a lot of my own experiences was that sense, that kind of very wide spectrum in terms of experiences with the guards and also I suppose with the court system. First of all, I don't think it's good enough that there's a range of experience. I think the experience has to be consistent. And I don't think there's room for kind of a grey area on that. I acknowledge that it's incredibly difficult, particularly for the guards who are kind of in that kind of first line of response, to know what to say, perhaps, to get it right all of the time. But I think they need to be supported appropriately. I think they need as much training as possible, and I suppose I don't know what training they get at the moment. Is that we're told that when something happens, if you experience a crime, come forward to the police, tell them. And if you're not getting a wholly supportive experience, it makes you wonder why you've bothered. Then you go through a court system that is absolutely traumatizing. It gaslights you, it questions whether it really happened, if you really remembered it that way. I don't think that should be allowed. So I think when the lockdown was initially announced, one of the first thoughts I had was, what about women in situations where there's live domestic abuse? The thought of being in a house where perhaps one's every move is already monitored and scrutinised just seemed terrifying to me. I suppose I thought about all this kind of small ways, you know, and if we think about it, all of our lives have been impacted by lockdown. And if we think about all of the anger and anxiety and sadness and frustration that any of us who aren't in a domestic abuse situation have experienced as an almost norm, as a normal response to lockdown, and then to think about someone who was already terrified being in the home, who perhaps made as many kind of ways to be out of the home as possible, to suddenly be stuck in that home. I think that we need to see an increased response to how we support women who are in very vulnerable, very dangerous situations. We know that lives can get lost through this, and I don't think that should be the only thing that we focus on. We should be looking at the impact in terms of well-being, trauma, employment, also thinking that we're within a housing crisis, and for a lot of women it potentially becomes a case of, well, either I stay in this home, I stay in this house where there are four walls and a roof, or I have nowhere else to go. And I just don't think in 2020 that that's acceptable. I think our government do have to step up.
Thank you very much to, first of all, to Sarah for so succinctly giving us an outline of the main points in the impact report and the supplementary report on the COVID-19 emergency. And of course, a very big thank you to Niamh Ní Dhomhnaill for speaking to us so bravely and so honestly about her own dreadful experience. She is a generous and a strong woman, and we thank her very wholeheartedly for that. And I would now like to invite Commissioner Drew Har to address us, the Commissioner of Garda Síochána. He will give us an update on the response of Garda Síochána during the COVID-19 national emergency, during which I think he will speak about Operation Fuishiv. And I was struck when I heard that word first about how wonderful it was, meaning some kind of relief and alleviation for people who are suffering or in a traumatic situation. And I believe that the Commissioner, he will also address plans to prioritise domestic violence into the future. You're very welcome, Commissioner. Thank you very much.
Good morning. Thanks very much, Ailbhe, and thank you to Sarah for the invitation to speak this morning. Very obviously, here in Ireland, we've lived through these extraordinary times brought in by the COVID-19 emergency. And can I just say very briefly, by background, there was four main areas, I think, for ourselves in terms of response. One, obviously, in terms of policing the regulations, and wrapped up with that was our community policing response. Secondly, then, was a response to organised crime, and internationally we were warned, and then we could see ourselves the threat that posed, particularly online, but also here locally as well. And so a lot of effort went into the prevention and detection of crime involving organised crime groups. But lastly, it was very clear from early international experience as COVID-19 spread across the globe, and the early experience of lockdowns was almost an immediate increase in the instances of domestic abuse. So we were very conscious about that, and that should be an integral part of our policing response to the emergency that we faced. And very obviously, the restrictions and the lockdown that was imposed had the potential and the reality to allow abusers to increase the intensity of their abuse and their control over their victims. So not only to hope to touch upon coercive or about abuse and assault today, but also obviously coercive control. There was a couple of elements of, to our initial response with Operation Fusive, and that was our media campaign, our focus on the domestic violence court orders that were in place, both the service of those that hadn't been served, but also then the enforcement of them when they were breached. And then a focus on our domestic abuse callbacks. This is a standing target in our policing plan, and we really want to improve our performance there because we saw this as a lifeline in terms of getting in behind closed doors and speaking to victims, but also then follow-up calls to previous victims as well to see that check that all was well and that we were available should they need our assistance. We had a media and awareness campaign which rolled out on the 1st of April, and we had also very positive feedback from not only statutory agencies but agencies such as Women's Aid, and we were very grateful for that because all of those things made a difference in terms of response. The operation was further supported by the Still Here media campaign, which the Department of Justice ran, and that involved the release of radio and television adverts. But throughout this period, we ourselves saw an increase in the number of calls that we received. We were very conscious about what our internal response should be. We concentrated specifically on perpetrators and on the execution of domestic abuse court orders, and we designated particular weeks of strong proactivity right across the organisation in terms of our activity on the ground. And in the period January to August 16, we have detected 2,266 breaches of order incidents so far, and that's an increase of 16.7% in the corresponding period in 2019. So that gives you an indication of the increase in our activity over the COVID-19 period. As I've said, we adopted a proactive approach. We kept in touch very much with between the national unit responsible for protective services and then the local protective service units in districts and divisions. And this engagement continues, and compliance within divisions is monitored very regularly. The increase that we have seen is in the order of approximately 20% as we stand at this moment in time. So some 27,174 incidents to date falling into the category of domestic abuse. That's a huge number, and it's a really significant policing issue for us. We are very mindful that these are very vulnerable victims and that we have a huge responsibility in terms of our response to them and indeed how we protect them going forward. In terms of our callbacks, we put in place processes to ensure our callbacks were being followed through on. We're showing a 72% callback rate within the allotted time scales, and that's up from 40% for the year 2019. If I just touch briefly then on coercive control, already it's been referred to this morning, but if I touch upon what has been a real life case, but coercive control in Ireland means knowingly and persistently engages in behaviour which has serious effect on a relevant person, is obviously controlling or coercive. A reasonable person would consider it likely to have a serious effect, and a serious effect for these purposes means a fear that violence may be used or serious alarm or distress that has an adverse impact. Now, coercive control was introduced, and we put in place then a training program for our protective service units, and we've already had our first conviction. And what it meant in that case was that a man, and the offender in this case, telephoned their girlfriend 6,000 times over a 3-month period, forced their girlfriend to take their phone everywhere so that they knew exactly where she was, calling their girlfriend on FaceTime and then making her scan her immediate surroundings, violently taking their girlfriend from a bar in front of her friends and then assaulting her outside the bar. And also then the destruction of clothes and destruction of a hair straightener to prevent her from going out. And so it was a real life example of coercive control. At the moment then, we have other investigations ongoing. And what we have seen so far is we've seen that offenders, suspected offenders, are micromanaging victims' actions and interactions. And this is particularly concerning at this time where, as has already been stated, there are limited opportunities to escape the immediate attention of the perpetrator, monitoring behaviours, actual imposing isolation, imposing some form of emotional and psychological abuse, economic abuse by the retention of money, threats and intimidation, stalking and harassment, including using technology, criminal damage, and indeed, obviously then, other offences of sexual abuse or physical violence. And what we look for then is a pattern of abuse and more than a single incident of violence. We've raised awareness of coercive and controlling behaviour within the organisation and put in place specialist training. We want to understand it and recognise it when we see it, and it is more than a violent incident, more than physical harm, and support victims to make them aware that this behaviour is illegal and is not normal behaviour. And we would encourage recording of all incidents, no matter how small, in terms of reporting these matters to Garda Síochána. As I've said, we've had one conviction to date. There are a number of other cases currently before the courts, and investigations are currently ongoing in respect of a further 32 incidents. So this crime already is becoming prevalent, and as we learn more about the evidence and the proofs required, then we can have more success. But part of delivering that success is our ongoing focus on specialist detectives to deal with crimes of domestic abuse and violent sexual assault and child abuse. We have in place our divisional protective service units. The rollout of that will finish in September, and the last 6 will go in place. And these ensure a consistent and a victim-centered investigation. They also ensure that this is conducted to a high professional standard, and all have received professional training in the standards required, and indeed the response to victims to make sure that we gain the evidence and are able to bring suspected offenders to justice. We also have in place clear guidance in terms of keeping the victim updated and being very aware of the needs of the victim in these very personal and intimate crimes. To date, we have 19 divisional units in place, and a further 6 then will go in place in September, and that will complete the rollout. And between the divisional units and the national units, we have some 350 detectives engaged in protective service work. And this is considerable advance for the organisation. And now we're in the position of embedding that, ensuring professional response, ensuring victims receive also a uniformly high response, no matter where they are. We've had very positive feedback from victims, from other agencies, and particularly DPP has commented very favourably on the quality of the files, of the investigation files that they are receiving. And I hope then over time we will see increased reporting of both sexual violence crimes and crimes of domestic abuse, as people can have more confidence in our response and the professionalism of that response, and also then working together with other criminal justice partners to ensure that individuals can feel confident in coming forward. And I'd also point then to the recent O'Malley report, which will make a difference in terms of the investigations of such crimes and the difference then that the victim will experience. And I know that the Minister of Justice has particular focus in this area. We've had a number of discussions on what more we might do collectively as an organisation, as Garda Síochána, to improve our service, but then how collectively we can work together with other partners to further improve our national response to crimes such as serious sexual assault and domestic abuse. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Commissioner Harris. That was, a very extensive outlining of the response, the work of Garda Síochána, and also the work which is in process. And I mean, I note, as I'm sure many people have, that the work of training and awareness building in relation to coercive control is very, very welcome indeed. Thank you again very much for being with us this morning. I would now like to ask the Honourable Judge Colin Daly, who's President of the District Court, to speak to us. I know that President Daly will highlight, or at least we certainly asked President Daly to highlight the challenges for and the response by the family law system during the COVID-19 emergency, and the actions and the innovations, because I think we do know that these are necessary, that are in the planning process to meet the needs of the victims of domestic violence. President Daly, you're very welcome.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to participate on this panel today, and for your very kind introduction. First of all, I would like to congratulate and to commend Women's Aid on the 2 reports that you've launched today. The reports themselves and the information and the data that they contain, they really contribute very valuable in very valuable ways to our understanding of the issues of domestic violence. And of course, I'm sure they assist you very much in your policy work. Obviously, policy work is not something that the courts can be involved with, but similar to organisations such as yourselves, we provide a service in the courts as you provide a service outside of the courts. And the information that you've contained in your reports are essential to all of us when we look at how we can better plan responses to domestic violence. As well as the data and the information that's contained in your reports, I think one of the most powerful elements of the reports are the stories that are told, which provide a really important social context within which we can place the serious consequences of the experience of domestic violence to the mainly women who have experienced it, some men, but also to the very significant number of children that are involved. These stories clearly show us the extraordinary prevalence of emotional abuse, and not just the physical abuse that we might ordinarily have associated with domestic violence, but also the financial abuse. And it's very interesting to see how this, the reporting of this has increased so significantly, and also sexual violence and sexual abuse. The stories tell of the consequences of this type of abuse, leading to poverty and to isolation and to physical and psychological harm for the women involved, and also particularly for the children involved. And I think one of the stark facts or numbers that comes out of both reports is the fact that 1 in 4, or perhaps even as high as 1 in 3 women will at some point in their life experiencing domestic violence. And I think in the 21st century, that really is quite extraordinary. One of the takeaway points for me from the 2 reports is that the number of contacts that have now moved online, particularly in the last number of months. And I think this really must inform any of us who are providing services in the 21st century, how we're going to continue to provide those services. So I've been asked to look at domestic violence and the district court's responses to it today. And I was really struck by Niamh Ní Dhomhnaill's interview and her description of her experience of the court system. And certainly her experience perhaps was slightly atypical in the sense that her experience was with one of the higher courts. And anyone who's experiencing domestic violence in Ireland today and who's going to look for relief from the courts for domestic violence is most likely to come to the district court for help. First of all, probably through our civil family law jurisdiction, and perhaps later on through our criminal jurisdiction. Having read your reports, and also having heard Commissioner Harris, I'm struck by how a lot of the figures come together. In 2019, Women's Aid reports a 9% increase in your responses to demands for services. And in the district court, in that year, we saw a 10% increase in the incoming cases seeking domestic violence reliefs. And I think it's also fair to say that this annual increase in demand for services is a constant feature of both Women's Aid and other support services, but it's also a constant feature in the district court. I think since 2014, there's been an almost 75% increase in demand for family law reliefs across the board. And for us in the courts, as no doubt it is for you in Women's Aid, it is an extraordinary challenge to meet the demand in the increasing demands with resources that remain the same, or perhaps in your case have even diminished. And that will be a constant and a continual demand, I fear. I was also struck by the fact that last year you responded to over 2,700 requests for help, and in the district court in domestic violence, we responded to over 2,500 requests for reliefs and for orders. Where the figures don't converge so greatly as in the 2020 figures so far. During the course of the emergency response to Covid-19, we saw a 17% increase in demand for incoming cases for relief in domestic violence in the district court. And this relates or compares to the 43% increase in calls to your helpline and the over 70% increase in visits to your website. So I think this reflects the fact that perhaps those most in need of protections were, for a large number of reasons, finding it difficult to find their way to courts for help. And that is something that we do have to take into consideration. Just to quickly review how the district court has responded to COVID-19 in the family civil law jurisdiction. On the 13th of March, I issued a district court notice, and that notice stated that the district court could only remain open for urgent business. But obviously, and importantly, we noted that in family law, the courts would have to remain open to hear domestic violence applications for protection. On the 24th of March, I issued a family law statement and directed parties to other civil organisations such as Women's Aid for support. And I'm glad to see from the figures that you're reporting today that you were able and there to be able to provide support to so many people who needed it at that time. On the 19th of May, I issued a practice direction around live television link or remote hearings, and I provided guidelines for how these could be used in childcare cases. And since the 13th of March, the district court has provided a full schedule of services across more than 40 locations around the country on an almost daily basis. Our service has been reduced, but I believe that we have been there to ensure that there has been access to the courts where it's been absolutely necessary. And at this point, I would really like to pay tribute to and to thank the court service staff who really responded with heroic effort to be able to provide courts and to continue to provide courts in extremely difficult circumstances. On the criminal jurisdiction, the district court's response to the COVID-19 emergency, again, and reiterating what Commissioner Harris has just said, we also saw an increase in prosecutions for domestic violence. And I don't have the figures easily available to me just at the present, but certainly the 20% increase that Commissioner Harris reflects would also reflect our experience in the district court. And it's through the prosecutions that have been brought since March, that in the courts we are able to recognise how Garda Síochána has been responding to complaints for breaches of domestic violence orders. In the District Court and in the Dublin Metropolitan District in particular, we've prioritised the hearing of these cases. And since the end of April, we have provided a response where if a prosecution is brought today, then in all likelihood, the hearing would proceed and would be adjudicated upon within 3 to 4 weeks. We've also engaged with the probation service where appropriate and where people have been convicted to put them under supervision of the probation service where they haven't received a custodial sentence, as the probation service has provided a very essential service in supervising the abusers in certain circumstances. And indeed, I think they have played a very important role in being one of the few organisations that actually reaches out and tries to work with the abusers during this time in order to try to reduce the incidence of further incidences from occurring. The lessons that we've learned over the last number of months are quite a few. We've learned of the absolute need to keep courts accessible for emergency orders. The figures of a 17% increase in applications for protection orders on the same period last year are really illustrate this fact. And in fact, if we look at the figures and compare them to 2018, we see that there's a 30% increase in demand on the same period. We've also learned the importance of the district court and the importance that it has in adjudicating disputes between families. And I use the term families there in the widest possible terms, especially at times of crisis, and particularly in a situation where the crisis itself may be external to the family and where the family is experiencing its own crisis. We've also learned that we need to develop new ways of accessing courts, including being able to lodge applications by email and also being able to deal with hearings by way of remote video access. And we've also learned the importance of communicating with the public and engaging with stakeholders. And the fact that we have been able to reach out to civil and community organisations such as Women's Aid during the course of this crisis, I think has strengthened and made better the responses of the district court in how we've dealt with things so far. And this is something that I would really like to continue into the future. And we've also learned that there's a particular difficulty in hearing the voice of children in circumstances such as the COVID-19 emergency response that we're living with at present. If we look then from these lessons and to how the future delivery of the family law courts might appear in the district court, I think we have to recognise here that restrictions are likely to be with us for some time. And our generation are the generation that will live in the shadow of this pandemic. And this is going to have a profound influence on how we plan future services in the immediate future, in the medium term, and I think into the long term also. And courts who are not necessarily noted for being flexible and are rather seen as being perhaps more rigid in how they approach matters, will need to be flexible and responsive in the ways that we have shown ourselves over the last number of months, and we will have to continue to be flexible and responsive as perhaps localized lockdowns as we see in 3 counties at the moment, or even perhaps the shadow of another national lockdown remains upon us. And I think very much a key part of this development will be the development of remote courts. If we look at how remote courts might be developed in the area of family law, certainly the very recent Civil Law and Criminal Law Miscellaneous Provisions Act of 2020 does 2 things. It provides for the electronic filing of documents in certain cases, and it also provides that judges and district court judges in particular are now not necessarily required to attend at the court building itself for a remote court to be convened. The result of this, I think, will provide a greater facility to provide remote hearings in the district court. We may need to await new rules of court for the filing of documents, but certainly I believe this new act will provide us with a greater facility to be able to develop remote courts in the very near future in family law and in domestic violence in particular. One of the challenges in creating remote courts in family law is the preservance of the in-camera rule. And the question is, how can we ensure that those that are engaging with hearings, perhaps remotely, will not record or publish the proceedings? And this is based on experiences that we have already experienced in the district court, where participants in courts have published and recorded and published proceedings in ways that identify particularly the children that are involved in these cases. Obviously, the solutions to this concern might be the creation of further offences, but while that would be a matter for the legislature, in the interim, I believe that by developing a system of trusted intermediaries with principally civil and community organisations such as Women's Aid, whereby the organisation might provide the facility for a party to engage in a remote hearing, and that trusted intermediary would enter into a contract-like situation with the court office in order to give assurances that the in-camera rule and the other rules of court can be observed, might be the way forward in this regard. This is a conversation that we've already started with Women's Aid about how remote applications for ex-party applications in domestic violence situations can be achieved. And this is a conversation that I hope to further very early when we resume business from the 1st of September. And indeed, this will be one of my top priorities for the new legal term. Obviously, the development of remote courts in family law will have its challenges, not least of those the digital disadvantage and the recognition that some, not all people, will be able to engage with remote courts by way of intellectual difficulties or physical difficulties, by way of literacy difficulties, or by way of lack of access to adequate broadband. However, I think by creating access for those that can engage in remote courts will create a greater capacity for those who can't to attend at a more traditional court setting. So if we look at where we go to from here, the District Court intends to return towards as full a service as public health guidelines will allow from the 1st of September. We can only achieve this by scheduling courts and hearings as much as possible. And with family law cases, we can relatively easily provide a safe court environment. However, the large gathering of numbers of people in the court environments waiting for cases to come on can no longer be the norm. However, we will strive to provide space for court support services such as those provided by Women's Aid. The capacity for the District Court to meet demands in family law cases generally in the DMD, but particularly outside of the DMD, in many places will be severely impacted. However, domestic violence cases will always be given priority wherever possible. In the coming months, I believe that we're going to see the need and the absolute need for the type of dedicated family law division that has recently been described as one of her priorities by the new Minister for Justice. And I certainly hope that that initiative will proceed with all haste. So that's my views on where we are, where we've been, and where we might go. And so to conclude, I would like to wish Women's Aid continued success in your important work. And I very much look forward to seeing the development of remote courts for ex-party domestic violence applications in the coming months. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, President Daly, for a very informative and I think a very thoughtful and thought-provoking presentation to us this morning, where I think your point is very well made about our having to continue to live with restricted circumstances in the future, and therefore putting in place systems and not least court systems which can flexibly respond to increasing and constantly increasing need. Thank you and for that presentation. And I will move now straight away to welcome Roderic O'Gorman, TD, who is Minister for Children, Disability, Equality and Integration. And I would first of all like to congratulate you, Minister, on your appointment and to wish you well in your endeavours. We're absolutely delighted to have you here with us today to give us an insight into the government's plans for tackling domestic, sexual and gender-based violence, and particularly, I think, the role of your own department relating to the issue, the very particular issue of funding for specialist domestic abuse services and the prevention of domestic, sexual and gender-based violence. And this obviously in the light of the very stark and harrowing figures and experiences that we have, that we see in the reports and that we've also heard from this morning. You're very welcome, Minister.
Thanks very much, Ailbhe. Can you hear me all right there?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great, thanks very much. Listen, thanks to you for asking me to speak here today, and thanks to yourself and Sarah for the invitation to launch this report. And I look forward to working with you both over the next number of years. Look, I suppose I'd like to begin maybe by paying tribute to the heroic work that those on the front line who have been providing services for women and families fleeing domestic, sexual and gender-based violence, and including those in your own organisation, in the staff and volunteers of Women's Aid. Through your work, whether it's providing information, support, outreach services, or even just offering some helping hand, a listening ear, you've transformed lives, but you've actually managed to save lives as well. And I'm very proud to be the Minister with a role supporting these key services in what is an unprecedented time for our country. So again, on my behalf and my department's behalf, thank you to all of you for what you've done and for what you continue to do. We're experiencing a worldwide pandemic, but while we're experiencing that, we know that many people are experiencing a more hidden and insidious disease and its effects, that of domestic and sexual violence. And all of you here today know the devastating effects of abuse that takes place behind closed doors. And where this abusive behaviour is already in place, is already in existence, the evidence tells us that it can actually grow, it can get worse during public health restrictions like we're experiencing here in Ireland in relation to COVID-19. And responding to this problem, both in general and in the context of the coronavirus, is absolutely vital. My department provides funding to TUSLA, the Child and Family Agency, to support 60 organisations nationwide that work directly with individuals experiencing DSGBV. And these organisations, they provide emergency domestic violence refuge accommodation, they have community-based domestic violence services and sexual violence support services. And funding in this area has increased by 4.7 million since 2016, and this included a 1.5 million increase last year. And this additional funding has enabled the further expansion and development of services, including the recruitment of 12 new outreach workers for victims of domestic violence in identified areas of need, and the rollout of a 12-week healing programme for children who've been impacted by domestic abuse. A significant number of commitments related to DSGBV are included in the new programme for government. In tandem with the next national strategy on domestic, sexual and gender-based violence, the government will also bring forward a national preventative strategy, recognising that we need to place a greater focus on the root causes of this violence. And we've committed to an audit of how responsibility for this issue is split among different departments and state agencies. As you will know, the Department of Justice is the lead department on DSGBV issues, but a range of other government agencies, departments, bodies, my own department, TUSLA, the HSE, the Department of Housing and Planning, and others all have some roles in setting policy for or delivering services to the victims of DSGBV. And we need to assess how policy is best led across all these actors, obviously always with the overriding objective of delivering the best and the most effective response possible for victims and potential victims of violence in this country. And in doing so, we have to be mindful of successful practice in other jurisdictions and what of that can be applied here in Ireland, particularly with a view towards the rollout of a national preventative strategy. Also, the government will be implementing a plan for future refuge spaces, and that will be informed by a review that's currently been undertaken by TUSLA, and I'll speak a little bit more about that later on. Specific training will be introduced for the Gardaí, for legal professionals and for court service personnel so that they may better prosecute the crime of coercive control. And the government will also implement and adopt a comprehensive strategy to combat trafficking of women and girls. And I'll be working closely with all my cabinet colleagues, but in particular with the Minister for Justice, Helen McEntee, on these issues. I hope that those of you here today, and indeed everyone working in this sector, will see that these commitments represent a clear prioritisation of issues related to domestic, sexual and gender-based violence by this government. The commitments, these commitments, they're an absolute priority for me, and I'm incredibly pleased to have been appointed to a department where I can be involved in the implementation of these vital policies. Organisations such as Women's Aid, supported by TUSLA, have ensured that women in often impossible situations can get advice and support. In particular, reassuring women that there is a way out and that they're not alone is absolutely vital. It's always been part of the work of Women's Aid, but we as a society, we all have a responsibility in this respect. And the Women's Aid Annual Impact Report provides us with a vital snapshot of the experiences of women who contacted its services in 2019. And its COVID-19 report provides us with information on more recent developments during the current pandemic. And between March and June of this year, Women's Aid responded to over 6,500 calls on its 24-hour national helpline. And the volume of calls represents a 43% increase on the volume on the same period last year. TUSLA has committed over €600,000 to DSGBV services as a response to COVID-19, and this is on top of the additional, on the existing core funding of 25.3 million for services this year. And since the beginning of the crisis, TUSLA has been actively engaging with all services in the sector to support continuity of service. And look, I understand this has been a difficult time for organisations, and some have seen refuge space closed due to social distancing requirements or have had to provide cover for staff who've been self-isolating. But to support service provision at this time, TUSLA, in conjunction with local authorities and other stakeholders, has sourced additional accommodation for emergency refuges, has supported services to ensure that staffing resources are adequate. It's assisted in the preparations and contingency planning, and it has provided additional financial support, PPE equipment and direct ICT resources for providers. It's been a time when teamwork has been really important, and the work of everybody across the community and voluntary sector and in state services has been really important in pulling together for a core cause. And my own sense of where I live in Dublin 15 was that voluntary groups have gotten behind DSGBV services in a way that I've never seen before, particularly in terms of collection of PPE, provision of sanitisers and the donation of other sanitary products. And I hope this level of effective cooperation, both in terms of cooperation between state agencies, but also that degree of community support will continue long after this pandemic has abated. I want to welcome the priority response of Garda Síochána in the context of Operation Fuaisceamh and the awareness raising campaign that was led by the Department of Justice through Still Here. As we know, the Gardaí are often the first port of call when someone's safety or security is at stake. And I'm delighted that Commissioner Harris was able to join the discussion today, and I'm very appreciative of the work the force has done in assisting victims of domestic violence, particularly in recent months. As you know, the previous government ratified the Istanbul Convention in 2019, and this is a very significant legal instrument in addressing the fight against domestic and sexual violence. And one of the main aims of the convention is to protect women against all forms of violence, including domestic and sexual violence. The National Strategy for Women and Girls and the National Traveller and Roma Integration Strategy both acknowledge the effects of DSGBV on women and girls. And in her introduction earlier on, Sarah made the point that DSGBV is motivated by inequality. As Minister for Children, Disabilities, Equality and Integration, I'm aware that domestic violence can disproportionately affect the lives of certain groups, particularly travellers and members of the Roma community, persons with disabilities, those who find themselves homeless or suffering from addiction, and many in our new communities or those living in direct provision. Now, this isn't unique in Ireland, but knowing what we do know, it's important to be as inclusive as possible in considering policy and service provision. So, for example, TUSLA is currently working on 2 pilot projects with the Traveller and Roma communities to combat domestic violence, and planning in other areas is underway. All barriers to DSGBV supports in our society must be removed. DSGBV can impact a person no matter where they live, what language they speak, or what their home environment is. And in that regard, I'd like to draw particular attention to the Women's Aid telephone interpretation service, which provides support to callers in over 170 languages. This can and has made a real difference for migrant women and members of our new communities who may not know how to access services or where to turn to. And other inclusive responses, like your text services for those who may be deaf or hard of hearing, eliminates these barriers that may exist for women in need of support. I mentioned a refuge space earlier on, and notwithstanding the difficulties that COVID-19 has brought in terms of service delivery, I'm pleased to note that 2 new refuges have opened their doors in South Dublin and Galway City since the end of last year. They're operated by Saoirse Women's Refuge and Cope Galway, supported by TUSLA. I know that many stakeholders are concerned that there is currently a shortage of emergency refuge space. It's clear that the housing crisis is and continues to put significant pressure on existing services. TUSLA is currently conducting a review of specialist domestic violence accommodation throughout the country. I expect the substantial work of this review to be completed by later on in this year, and my officials are in regular contact with TUSLA on this issue and will continue to support the organisation in this review. And indeed, in my first meeting with Bernard Gloucester, the CEO, and Pat Rabbitt, the chair of TUSLA, we specifically discussed the status of this review. I want to conclude by acknowledging that big challenges remain in getting to a stage where we can eliminate domestic, sexual and gender-based violence in Ireland. But I'm committed, and my Cabinet colleagues are committed, to doing this work, to working with yourselves in Women's Aid, to working with the other organisations, to learn from the progress that's been made so far, while always keeping in sight the fact of how much more there is still to be done. It's not going to happen overnight, but with continued investment, with the right policies, with the right governance, and always taking an evidence-based approach, I believe that we can succeed. And I look forward to working with Women's Aid over the next number of years in achieving this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister. Very reassuring to hear of the really determination to prioritise work in this area on the part of government. That's so important, and very important to hear at the present time, where the future is, shall we say, uncertain in relation because of COVID-19. And I was also very struck, of course, by your comments on how domestic violence disproportionately affects particular groups of women who are so often and typically very marginalized. I would like, and thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today, and obviously we look forward to following up with you in the very near future, immediately really, on these issues. But I'm going to go straight away to questions and answers, and I have been receiving some questions from Christina here in Women's Aid, who has been monitoring the feed. And I'm going to start off with yourself, Minister, since you still have the chair there, so to speak. And I'm picking up on the issue of refuges, which you mentioned in your talk. There were fewer refuge spaces, obviously, available during COVID-19. And Ireland already had a very serious shortage of spaces even before the virus hit. So do you know if the government will commit to having one refuge space for every 10,000 people, as the Istanbul Convention recommends? And I think that is the key thing. It's not just opening another refuge somewhere. It is basically looking at the population as a whole. So if I could put that question to you now, Minister.
Thanks, Ailbhe. Yeah, no, look, I think as you say, and as the questioner has said, the COVID crisis has drawn everyone's attention, and I know it was well known within your own sector already, but I think it's drawn everyone's attention to the fact that we have a shortage of refuge spaces nationally. And I think also there's very acute shortages in certain parts of the country as well, and that also forms part of my discussions with Bernard and with Pat Rabbitte about how we can support particular areas where the lack of space is particularly critical. I'm looking forward to seeing the outcome of the consultative review being undertaken by TUSLA at the moment, because I think that, and I spoke earlier on about the need for an evidence-based approach to all our policy solutions when it comes to this area. So I'm looking forward to seeing that. And I'll be using that in my engagement with TUSLA, but also in my engagement with the Cabinet in guiding how we focus our need to provide additional refuge spaces. I'm aware of what the Istanbul Convention says about the needs of specific numbers of refuge spaces to a country's population, and as a state we have signed up to the Istanbul Convention, so I think that absolutely needs to be what guides government's approach and my own department's approach to this particular issue. But I think particularly when it comes to the need to address the gaps in provision in certain parts of the country, I think the consultative report being undertaken by TUSLA will be hugely useful. And I think once I receive that and I suppose get the time to digest it myself, I'd hope to engage with many of the service providers in the country to get their own sense of the recommendations from that particular report.
Well, thank you very much for that. That's great. There is an ancillary part to that question, which is that, of course, in view of restrictions and social distancing, it's also been pointed out that the way in which space is configured in refuges will have to be given very serious consideration. And I wonder if you have any comment on that.
It will, and I suppose I'm also acutely aware of that in the context of the area of direct provision, which will be moving into my department in the near future, in that we've seen how the current, well, again, telling us something we probably all knew already, that the direct provision system is not fit for purpose by the congregation of people and the inability to socially distance. And I know that's why we have lost a significant number of refuge spaces, in that the inability the inability of people in those spaces to socially distance meant that that capacity had to be reduced in a number of places. So look, I think that is, I suppose COVID is going to change how we do things in a lot of areas. And I think following on from the TUSLA review, any new refuge space created has to be COVID proofed, I suppose, to put it colloquially.
Thank you very much, Minister. I have a question now for Commissioner Harris, which actually, Minister, you might wish to comment on as well, but the question specifically addressed to Commissioner Harris is, what will the government and Garda do to protect women living in dangerous situations should the country go into lockdown or near lockdown again?
Even without the terrible vista of going back into lockdown, that is a continuing issue. And I think what I would point out to is that we have, in September, we've rolled out our Divisional Protective Service units entirely across the whole country. These are specialist detectives. They've received training, and we have prioritised the training of individuals being appointed to protective service units at this moment in time. So literally the only professional training that we are undertaking at this moment in time is for our student officers, some other specialist areas, and then protective service units. So we've made a real priority of this to make sure that we have skilled people in place with the necessary skills in to deal both with the victim, but also obtain the necessary evidence. And obviously a very essential part of that is that they know that they're receiving a service which is confidential, and that any information, etc., that they impart will be dealt with overtly confidential and with confidence and confidentiality. So that's a significant uplift in the provision of our services, and it's here to stay as well. We see it as being very important, and we hope then that it'll encourage further reporting not only of physical abuse but also of coercive control and coercive abuse, as I spoke about earlier.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm not sure if you, Minister O'Gorman, want to comment on that. Not. I think that
I wouldn't have a huge amount to add to what the Commissioner is saying. I think, you know, we, if such an event did occur, we'd seek to learn from, I suppose, the successes of Operation Freeship, learn from the successes of what the Gardaí were able to do, and I think it has been recognised that a lot was done during COVID, and re-implement them, but also improve and learn from any improvements that I'm sure that the Gardaí have recognised in their provision of services. But obviously it'll be the Commissioner and the Minister for Justice leading out on that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I have questions for President Daly. There have been a number of comments, President Daly, welcoming the proposition to move to remote hearings and, you know, other kinds of mechanisms which might create greater efficiencies and minimise the amount of time that victims have to engage with the court system, which is a constant problem. There are in fact some comments and observations about the length of time that those suffering abuse have to engage with the courts, and often with multiple proceedings. So a specific question arising in this context is if you have any comment on the prospective review of the family law system and how this might reduce the length of time victims and survivors have to engage with the court.
Very good. Thank you, Ailbhe. I'm going to do the last point first. The Department of Justice and the Minister for Justice are proposing creating a standalone family law division within the District, Circuit and High Courts. I think what's envisaged is that there will be a system which will kind of stand beside the existing District Court, Circuit Court and High Court, And certainly that is a proposal by the legislature that I think most of us in the judiciary would welcome and support. Obviously, the policy is a matter for government, but from our experience in the courts, we know that we have a year-on-year demand that we have to meet with the same resources that we had 5 years ago or 10 years ago. And I think one of the curious things of responding to COVID is that we now have a greater understanding of exponential growth. So, you know, this is another example of exponential growth of demand where we're expected to deal with it with the same level of resources. So if there's anything that's going to help that, I would certainly welcome it. With regard to the length of time that people might have to engage with the court in order to get protection, I think that's what we see as being part of the current challenge in the court system, is that because there's such a demand for services, it's extremely difficult for us to meet it with the resources that we have. So I would certainly hope that with a new family law division, that there would be much greater efficiencies in that regard. And then that's another reason why I would really think that this is a good idea. With regard to the current situation, I think curiously, as we move into providing services in response to the COVID emergency and the fact that we'll now be scheduling hearings as much as possible, and particularly in family law, I think a lot of people might find themselves waiting around court buildings a lot less than they might have done in the past. They'll know what time their case is scheduled for, and they'll know what time the next case is scheduled for. So I would certainly hope that people would have to spend a lot less time waiting outside courts for their cases to come on. With regard to remote hearings, I may have raised expectations here, and I want to manage those expectations perhaps just a little bit. In highly contentious cases, it may not be a reality that a remote hearing would be the best way of hearing the case. What we have found, and this is an experience which is shared with judiciaries right around the world, is that while remote hearings are very good, that they're very good in a limited kind of way, and they lend themselves to the more non-contentious type of hearing. What we find as judges is that it's extremely important for us to have people present with us, particularly in contentious cases, so that we can actually see how they give their evidence and to see how they respond perhaps to the evidence that somebody else has given. And you know, what happens in that situation really informs how the decision that might be made. So we would certainly look towards having some remote hearings for ex parte applications. That's where there's only one party giving evidence. But in a hotly contested safety order or barring order application, for example, it may not be the best way to have the case heard. And I certainly acknowledge that it must be extremely difficult for victims of domestic violence to have to engage with a system where they have to tell their story again and again and again. And we do realize how difficult that can be for people. But, you know, we have a justice system that requires business to be conducted in this way.
Well, thank you very much for that. I have a question now for Commissioner Harris. And it's a question, Commissioner, about the enforcement of domestic violence orders. Some of the people attending today have raised the importance of having consistent enforcement and sanction of breaches. And another attendee has raised the issue of policing in rural areas and the reluctance that can exist for some women not to come forward to the police, particularly if they're living in quite small communities. So do you think, Commissioner, is there anything that can be done to encourage more reporting and that will increase trust that domestic violence orders will actually be reinforced?
Okay, well, thank you. Well, in the first part of that question, in terms of actual enforcement, I would point to, as I've already said, the 16.7% increase that we've seen this year in terms of enforcing offences recorded around breach of the various orders, be it barring orders, be it protection or safety orders. So that is a reality of our work. We've had 2,266 offences detected in respect of breach of orders. So, and that is a national picture as well. And in terms of victims in more remote areas or in rural areas where they're concerned about community commentary and the sense of stigma that this may bring, and as other speakers have spoken about, as I've said already, we have specific divisional detective service units in place, and they will provide a well-trained, focused, victim-focused service which will deal with the issue in confidence. Now, ultimately, matters may have to go to court, very obviously, and that would be appropriate. But at the same time, we wouldn't tolerate, in terms of idle conversation or in terms of information being released inappropriately. Investigations are dealt with properly with people who are trained for those, and people should feel confident in the quality of response that they will get right across now the whole of Ireland in terms of domestic abuse or indeed serious sexual assault.
And thank you very much indeed. And I think we will need to draw the questions and indeed the answers to a close there, because I'd like to thank our panelists very much and to say how much we appreciate your having been with us today and your generosity in responding to the questions. I think we could have gone on a lot longer. I want to say that I think it has really been a very, very informative and genuinely very, very interesting morning, and also encouraging to hear the openness with which each of our speakers has indicated their awareness of the real importance of prioritising the issue of domestic violence, which simply cannot continue, because I think COVID-19 has been terrible and dreadful in many ways, and dreadful for women who have suffered so much and so much violence. On the other hand, I think we can say that it has perhaps helped some women to step forward, to come forward, to seek help, to speak about the issue. And certainly I think that overall awareness of the terrible suffering, the terrible hurt and damage which is done to women and children because of violence and abuse, that has, it's not something which this country can ever close its eyes to or close its ears to again. And I think that we discovered that very, very clearly during the course of the emergency, which is not quite over, but nonetheless. And something I would like to say there is that was very evident to us in Women's Aid, with the great generosity of people who made really tremendous donations and very, very generously over the course of the pandemic, and how very much we appreciated that. But also that is a measure of people's very real concern and their real desire to see violence against women and children ended, prevented, stopped, and those who committed the perpetrators, for them to be appropriately sanctioned and punished. I also, of course, want to acknowledge and salute the really quite extraordinary work of Women's Aid in 2019, and again, most recently, over the past few very difficult months, when they have been so innovative, they have been so flexible and so creative in really adapting to very, very different kinds and very difficult sorts of conditions, and an ever increasing demand for that really crucial listening and believing and supporting ear that is so important for a woman who is undergoing the terrible trauma of violence. I can honestly say that from my observation, from the CEO, Sarah, right across the board, including all of the wonderful team and the brilliant volunteers who work with Women's Aid, you are just a marvel and an example to us all, and you give far above and beyond what should be required from workers and human beings generally. So thank you all very much. I would also, of course, like to thank members of the board of Women's Aid, who also give so generously of their time. And finally, to thank all those with whom we work in partnership. And I know that we will all continue to build as focused and as concerted an effort as we possibly can to really combat this terrible scourge. Thank you all very much. Thank you for attending this morning. Goodbye now.
Ailbhe, just very briefly, if I may, only a very practical thing. I just want to acknowledge the really engaged participation of our participants. We had a lot of questions. I want to thank our panel for your openness, your contributions. Again, it feels like, you know, there's a great cross-cutting sense of solidarity and partnership here, and we look forward to continuing all those conversations, particularly in respect of what Minister O'Gorman has said, which is this cross-cutting issue starts, it's almost cradle to grave, and therefore how do we manage everything from prevention right through to protection and everything else. But there are a large number of questions, and I don't know, Tom, who's doing our technical support, what we can undertake to do is to simply try and cut and paste them and simply share them with our speakers, because some are quite personal, some are quite specific, but they can give a flavour of all of the different ranges of concerns and questions that are coming up. Some are relevant to different people. So just to say that we will try and do that and share them, not necessarily to get a response, but really just to share that flavour of what is coming up for people, where are their concerns, and what are their specific experiences as might relate to the different portfolios of our speakers today. So apologies for butting in at the end, but just to say that. And thank you again to everybody.
Thank you. Goodbye now.